When the gleaming blade of the guillotine of fame fell, I felt its cold not on my neck but right in my bones, the sudden, bitter cold of total isolation that came not from without but grew from within, like a metastasis of truth eating away at a perfectly constructed facade. For the first time in 20 years, while I, Alexander Weil, had been building my empire from scratch to the pinnacle, where every breath was action and every step calculated, I met a gaze that held no respect, no fear, only a crystalline, ruthless indifference, and that gaze was the gaze of my own daughter, Amelia, who held in her hands the golden ticket I had given her, a Stanford diploma, but looked as if it had burned her fingers, an unbearable proof of my total control. I was sitting in my penthouse, with a panoramic view of New York, the city I considered my creation, my reflection, a city of endless possibilities, of ruthless success, a true symbol of the American mentality, where everyone must have their price, and where I was always the most expensive lot in the auction of life. When suddenly I heard an unusual silence that broke my monologue about the necessity of sacrifice for the sake of greatness, which was my favorite mantra, and it was the sound of the wine glass falling from my hands at her simple words that sounded like a sentence. "Dad, I'm not going to London, I'm not going to run your fund," she said, her voice calm as steel that wouldn't bend. "I'm marrying Michael, he's a public school teacher in Queens, and he and I just bought a tiny house with a mortgage, you know, a 30-year loan, and we're happy, Dad, really, without your billions and your success that you seem to wear instead of your heart, and I don't want any part of it. I'm giving up my name." It was the very moment when the billionaire, the titan, accustomed to buying, breaking, and remaking the world according to his own rules, suddenly realized his utter inability to buy or persuade the single, most important, most fragile part of his world, the love and respect of his own child, who had just consciously chosen a different kind of American dream, not the one about diamonds and yachts, but the one about debt, teaching, simple truth, and freedom from golden cages. It wasn't just my daughter's getting out of control, it was a public humiliation of my philosophy of life in her eyes, and therefore in my own, which instantly made my invincible world absurdly shaky. The shock of Amelia's choice, which I perceived as the greatest betrayal of my life principles, instantly transformed into a toxic mixture of anger and self-confidence, forcing me to act, as always, decisively and ruthlessly, to restore my order in a universe that had suddenly cracked. I called in my best lawyers and crisis communications specialists, hoping that a well-constructed PR campaign and financial pressure would force her to recover from this romantic madness that had shaken my reputation as a father who knew how to manage even the personal lives of his children. But what happened next was an unpredictable chain reaction that broke out of my control like wildfire on the prairie. My former business partner, Jonathan Spencer, whom I had taken out of the game a decade ago through some not-so-clean financial maneuvering, suddenly appeared on the cover of the Wall Street Journal with a sensational claim that my flagship company, Vail Industries, was built on falsifying environmental standards, and this was only the beginning of his retaliation, carefully planned throughout all these years of my triumph. The media, which had previously sung odes to me as the living embodiment of American success, suddenly turned into ravenous jackals that had sensed the weakness of a wounded lion, and every headline screamed about the rotten foundations of my empire, about the dark past and financial fraud that I had skillfully hidden for years behind a screen of philanthropy and elitism. I realized that this was not just Jonathan's revenge, it was a well-organized conspiracy of my competitors and politicians whom I had once tried to buy or bypass, and they all, taking advantage of my moment of weakness, decided to destroy me in order to free up the place at the top that, according to the cruel rules of this American capitalist battlefield, must always be occupied. Banks began to withdraw loans, the government initiated investigations, and the market reacted by collapsing stocks by 40% in one day, turning my virtual billions into real, tangible, bloody losses that sucked the life out of my assets like sand from underfoot. I wasn't just losing money, I was losing what I was, my reputation as an invincible person, because in America they don't forgive you when you fall from your pedestal, and the moment I turned to Amelia to at least listen to me, I saw on the threshold of her modest house, past which school buses drove, her gaze was filled not with hatred, but with a deep, all-consuming disgust, and it was worse than any bankruptcy. I lost my daughter, my business, my name, I was left alone in my golden cage, which I had built myself. After finally losing control of my finances and emotions, I found myself in my penthouse, which now seemed not a symbol of my power, but a glass mausoleum of my former life, and in this atmosphere of total destruction, when the outside world had turned into an enemy demanding my blood, for the first time in a long time I took off the mask of an imperturbable businessman and felt like just Alexander, a vulnerable, frightened man with no plan B. Just when I was ready to admit defeat, sinking into a black hole of self-pity and anger at injustice, a call rang out as if from the past, the name Elias Stone, my former personal assistant and lawyer, whom I had fired 15 years earlier for excessive decency and unwillingness to participate in my most questionable deals, flashed on the monitor, and it was at that very moment that I realized that there was someone else who did not wish for my ultimate demise, although he had every right to. Elias expressed neither sympathy nor condemnation, his voice calm and businesslike as ever, but with a strange determination as he announced that he had been working for several years to gather information that might not just exonerate me, but would completely change the rules of the game, turning the tables on me. Alexander, I always knew you weren't perfect, but I also knew you weren't a traitor. Jonathan Spencer, your former partner, is not just out for revenge. He is merely a pawn in the hands of a much larger, more powerful Wall Street financial group that seeks to monopolize the market, and your environmental fraud was just a pretext. They intended to destroy you in order to push their own, much dirtier energy bill through Congress that would bring them billions, and I have the proof, forbidden knowledge in the form of encrypted files that not only expose their conspiracy but also show that Spencer, in order to gain control, altered key documents in one of your old deals, shifting the blame for the real, serious crimes he committed onto you. This revelation became for me not just a saving straw, but a real source of rage, pure, rational rage against those who manipulate the system, and I realized that my fight was no longer a fight for money or reputation, but a fight for the truth, for the only shred of honor left in me after years of cynical success that had been the unstoppable engine of my American mentality. Elias handed me the flash drive, saying only, "There's enough here to put them all in jail, but you also have to admit your part of the blame to the world and to Amelia. The choice is yours. Use it to take back power, or use it to restore justice and for the first time in your life truly come clean." And it was at that moment that I felt the old, ossified shell of my selfish self begin to crack, and a completely new picture of the world appeared before my eyes, where wealth and power turned out to be just a smokescreen for deeper, darker games. Having received from Elias a flash drive with forbidden knowledge that could either restore my position, making me a victim of a political conspiracy, or reveal the whole truth, including my own, albeit minor, sins, I found myself at a real moral crossroads, feeling the pressure of billions of dollars and the weight of my conscience squeezing my chest with unbearable force. The American mentality, instilled in me since childhood, whispered about the need to win at all costs, that the survival of the fittest was the only law, and that I must use this information to protect my fortune and name. But Amelia's gaze, her quiet but categorical choice to live a simple life, seemed to echo in my mind like a constant echo, forcing me to doubt my own philosophy. I decided to take a risk bordering on suicide, choosing a path I had never considered before: public repentance and sacrifice, to save not my money but my last, fragile right to dignity and, perhaps, to regain the trust of my daughter, who had already become more valuable to me than any asset. I scheduled a confrontational meeting with Jonathan Spencer and the conspiracy's mastermind, an influential financier named Victor Corwin, in a neutral but public setting, a large, crowded conference room in the Federal Reserve Building, where I had managed to get under the guise of negotiating my bankruptcy, when in fact I had brought no lawyers with me, but only a single copy of the flash drive, ready to activate it. As Corwin, smiling smugly, began to lay out his terms for my complete submission and painless transfer of assets, considering me a broken and defeated man, I delivered a speech that none of my PR managers had prepared, and it was filled not with anger but with a strange, newfound honesty. "I accept your victory, Victor, but you have only won a fortune, and I have won something much more," I said, straightening up to my full height. "I admit, I broke the rules, I falsified data, because I was blind in my pursuit of success, because I believed that wealth was the ultimate truth. But you, Mr. Corwin, are doing the same thing, only on a much larger scale, and you are using me as a shield to cover up a crime against this country and its environment." Then, ignoring Corwin's pale face and Spencer's furious gaze, I announced not my victory or my defense but the public disclosure of all the information, both the information that exposed their conspiracy and the information that proved my own, lesser, environmental guilt, by handing the flash drive to a reporter from the New York Times who was present incognito. It was an act of utter self-destruction in a financial sense, but it was the only thing that could give me a chance at moral rebirth, at restoring my name in Amelia's eyes. I was losing everything, my assets, my reputation as an invincible businessman, my freedom, perhaps, but for the first time I felt truly free from the golden chain of my own false success, and it was a culmination of all or nothing. The following months were filled with legal battles, headlines, and the imminent collapse of my empire, but paradoxically, it was also a time of my greatest inner growth. A public admission of guilt, though painful, freed me from the years of hypocrisy I had carried behind the mask of a successful billionaire. Elias's revelations led to the arrest of Corwin and Spencer, as well as a major investigation that shook the financial world, proving that the true American mentality that rules the world often hides only boundless greed under the promise of opportunity, and I was its victim and accomplice at the same time. I had made a deal with the government, pleading guilty to lesser charges and agreeing to pay huge fines, which had almost completely drained my remaining assets but had allowed me to avoid prison and pursue atonement, a process that I had previously considered a weakness but now saw as the only path to true greatness. A year after my fall, I stood not in a sunlit penthouse but on the modest porch of Amelia's house in Queens, where the smell of cut grass and freshly baked bread was so far removed from my past that it seemed an illusion. I had come not to ask for forgiveness but to finally understand, and as I saw my daughter, who for the first time had not turned her back on me, I felt that my sacrifice had been worthy, for it had not been forced, but had been made out of a sincere desire to restore at least a semblance of justice, even if it had cost me everything. She handed me a cup of coffee, plain, not fancy, and said, "You chose to lose everything to save what really matters, Dad. I see that, and I don't need your money. I needed you." I realized that this was the resolution of my story, not in regaining wealth, but in consciously losing it in order to gain a human essence. Now, when I look at New York not from a bird's eye view, but from the modest apartment I rent while consulting for startups working on environmental projects, with money that I barely have, I understand that the question, "Is it possible to be rich and honest?" has no clear answer. Truth is always more important than success, but the real American dream is not about endless accumulation, but in the eternal right to a second chance, a chance at redemption, at rebirth, at finding moral company in a society where money is only a tool, not a goal. I have not fully redeemed my past, but I have found peace in choosing truth over power, and this is the message I leave to the world, the philosophical legacy of my fall.